Hi, I'm Chris Miller, and today we're going to be talking about the lift method, float fishing for tench. One of the most exciting ways to catch tench on the float. It's a historic method that goes back to the days of Mr. Crabtree. And the way it differs to normal float fishing is that instead of your float sort of sinking when the fish takes the bait and swims away, with this method, the float actually rises in the water. So it's a very visible sign that a tench has picked up your hook bait. Today I'm fishing an old estate lake. I've had the place to myself today. The only other anglers I've seen have been a heron and a kingfisher. I've caught a couple of tench. There are no monsters in here. They range between 3, 4 or 5 pounds. There's a chance of catching one of the sort of larger 6-pounders that have been in here for many years, but they're very wily fish. They've been fished for many years, and they're quite difficult to catch. And that's why I enjoy coming here, because it is a challenge. You can come one day and you can catch them on corn, you can come the following day and you don't catch anything. So it's quite a good idea to have a range of baits available, and I'll explain what baits I've been using in a few minutes. To explain the lift method in a bit more detail, the only weight on the line is sitting actually on the bed of the lake, and your hook bait is about 3 or 4 inches away from that weight. When the fish picks up the weight, the bait, it lifts the weight off the bottom, and consequently your float rises in the water. And there's no doubt, you know, there can be nothing else that causes your float to rise than a fish taking the bait. So it's a really exciting way of understanding what's going on there. Some of the problems that you can get when you're normally float fishing for tench, and if carp are in the swim, is very often the float can be moving around, it can be bumped as the fish swim into the line. With this method, you know that if the fish has the bait in its mouth, then it's going to rise up, and if you hit while the float is rising or shortly afterwards, you'll be connected to your tench. And that's when things go right. Nice little tench from this morning's session, so really pleased with that. Let's put it back. Okay, let's show you how the whole thing works. So we've got the Drennan drift beater float, and that's held in position with float stops and not shot. The reason why I use float stops is it's very easy for you to change the depth of your float just by sliding the float stop along the line. All you need to do is to wet it slightly, slide it slowly, and that will then lock the float in place. You'll note that I've actually got 3 float stops rather than 2. I've got one either side of the float, and I've got one below the float stop that's closest to the hook. And the reason for that is that if you catch a tench and you get taken through the weeds or through the lily pads, very often your float will slide and be knocked out of place because it's actually gone through vegetation. The float stop at the bottom is unlikely to move, and if you slide everything back to that position, then you'll be back to the depth you were fishing at before that happened. So that's a good little tip. Then between the float and your weight, there's nothing on the lines. There's no lead on the line at all, apart from this tungsten inline olivette, again made by Drennan. That's held together either side with float stops. So on the length of line you've got 5 float stops and a float, 3 around the float itself, and then 2 around the inline olivette. Again, you can change the distance between the weight and your hook just by moving the float stops. Bear in mind, if you do that, that will also change the height of your float, so you'll need to adjust that at the same time. And then you've got your hook bait. In this case I've got a small dendrobina. I always use barbless hooks, and if you use worms on barbless hooks, they'll come off. So I've got an artificial maggot there which holds the worm in place. And once that is sitting along the bottom and you've got the line from the weight coming up to the float, fish comes into the swim, picks up your bait, it lifts that tungsten weight, and then that means that your float will rise up in the water. So it's a very visible sign that you've got a bite, unmistakable. Nothing else can cause your float to rise other than a fish picking up your hook bait. So you need to strike, ideally while the float is still rising or shortly afterwards, because if you've seen any of the underwater videos, you'll see that tench and carp are taking in bait and blowing it out constantly. But if it's lifted that lead or that weight off the bottom, then it means your float has risen and you should be connected to your fish. So when you're tench fishing, it's quite important to have a wide range of bait, because they're very finicky feeders, and you've got to find the bait that they're feeding on that particular day. So I generally always have dendrobina worms with me. I usually tip those off with an artificial red maggot because I use barbless hooks. I'm using quite large hooks actually. These are size 8 super specialist Drennan hooks. I know I talk about Drennan tackle quite a lot. I'm not sponsored by them, but I find their products are really good, being designed with the angler in mind. And these are quite big size 8 hooks, and the reason why I'm using big hooks is I'm using big baits because I'm trying to avoid the rud. When hooking corn, I found quite a good way of disguising the hook and leaving your hook point clear. So I hook the grain of corn right in the center of the grain, and on this size hook I will always put 2 grains. I always select the grains that are closed kernels because I think they're stronger, more robust, and they withstand casting in and out. You know, the last thing you want is to be in a situation where your bait has come off and you're sitting there with a bare hook. And then by doing that, you can disguise your hook with 2 grains of corn, but you've still got the point of the hook showing, so it's easy for the tench to be pricked. So that's my sort of favourite way of hooking up corn. Another method that I use quite a lot is fishing with prawn, and that's been my successful method today. I've had 2 tench on prawn. And again, what I do there is taking the prawn, this one's come straight out of the freezer this morning. I tear off the tail, and I generally use that as loose feed. And then with a baiting needle, with one of these latches, I feed the baiting needle directly through the length of the prawn, like that. And then I take my size 8 hook and lock it in place with the latch, like that. And then I literally pull the hook through the prawn. I also use this method when I'm perch fishing as well. And then once I've done that, you just twist the hook so that it's still outside the prawn. And I just like to tidy the prawn up by taking any scrag ends off. Again, I'd throw that in as loose feed. And there we go, you've got a prawn and a disguised hook, but again, the hook point is still on the outside of the bait. So hopefully you found that useful. If you have, please like and subscribe to the video. If you have any comments, I'll reply to them if there's anything more that you need to know. This is the first video that I've done, but if it's well received, I'll do more. So thanks very much for watching, and tight lines, guys.